Your brain contains a hidden biological switch that voluntarily silences your moral judgment the moment someone with perceived authority enters the room. It is not a character flaw, and it is not cowardice. It is a hardwired neuro-architectural override designed to prioritize social hierarchy over individual conviction. When a uniform or a confident title issues a command, your prefrontal cortex actively downregulates its critical evaluation circuits, forcing you into a state of passive execution. You are literally wired to hand over the steering wheel of your own consciousness. Let us trace what actually happens inside your skull when you freeze, nod, and comply, even as your gut screams that something is wrong. Think back to the last time a manager made an absurd request in a staff meeting, or a doctor gave you an instruction that felt instinctively off, or a security officer directed you with unyielding certainty. You felt that cold knot in your stomach. Your internal alarm bells were ringing loudly, yet your mouth opened and said, "Sure, no problem." Why does your own moral compass get completely hijacked in a fraction of a second? For decades, we assumed that people who blindly obey authority are simply weak-willed or conformist by nature. But the reality discovered by social psychologists is far more unsettling. In 1963, social psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted one of the most famous and chilling experiments in human history at Yale University. He wanted to understand how ordinary, well-meaning citizens could participate in destructive acts simply because they were told to do so. Milgram invited everyday volunteers into a laboratory and asked them to administer increasingly severe electrical shocks to a person in another room whenever that person answered a memory test incorrectly. The person receiving the shocks was actually an actor who was pretending, but the volunteer pushing the buttons believed the shocks were painfully, devastatingly real. What Milgram found shattered our comfortable assumptions about human goodness. When an authority figure in a grey lab coat stood over the volunteer and calmly said, "The experiment requires that you continue," an astonishing 65% of participants administered the absolute maximum voltage level. They wept, they trembled, they sweat profusely, and yet they continued pushing the buttons. Milgram realized that human beings can undergo a radical psychological metamorphosis. He called it entering the agentic state. In the agentic state, an individual no longer views themselves as an autonomous actor responsible for their own choices. Instead, they view themselves merely as an instrument executing the desires of a higher authority figure. Your brain literally abdicates its responsibility. But for years, scientists asked, is this just a psychological excuse people make after the fact, or is there an actual, measurable physical shift occurring in the brain when we obey? Now, modern neuroscience has opened up the living human brain to reveal the exact biological wiring behind this terrifying phenomenon. In 2016, neuroscientist Patrick Haggard and his research team at University College London published a groundbreaking study that answered this question once and for all. They used electroencephalography and precise microsecond behavioral timing tasks to measure what happens to a person's implicit sense of agency when they take actions under command versus when they act voluntarily. When you act voluntarily, your brain experiences a fascinating perceptual phenomenon known as temporal binding. If you press a key on a piano, your brain naturally compresses the perceived time gap between your finger hitting the key and the sound coming out. This compressed timeline is the exact neural signature of personal ownership. It is your brain's internal tracking system saying, "I caused that." But when Haggard's team forced participants to act under explicit orders from an authoritative experimenter, something miraculous and frightening happened on the brain scans. The temporal binding effect completely vanished. Under command, the brain physically processed the consequences of its own actions as if someone else had performed them. The auditory evoked potentials in the brain flattened out completely. The neural signatures of agency dropped off a massive cliff. Do you realize what this means? When you are commanded by an authority figure, your brain is not lying to avoid conflict. It is genuinely experiencing a shift in baseline perception where it feels less causal power over the real world. Your neural circuits shift from a driver state to a passenger state. The temporoparietal junction, which helps you process self-other boundaries and moral evaluation, drops its neural firing rate. At the same exact time, the anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors errors and moral conflict, gets suppressed because the external authority has absorbed the perceived risk. Is your compliance really a conscious choice, or is your brain simply running a biological self-preservation program? Think of your brain like a massive electrical grid in a metropolitan city. Under normal conditions, every neighborhood manages its own power consumption and keeps its localized safety breakers flipped on. But when an external authority signal is detected, a high-voltage master breaker trips automatically. The local circuits go dark. The local neighborhood loses its ability to turn off its own lights because the grid operator has taken remote control. This neural handover is fueled by a second powerful biological mechanism, the diffusion of responsibility. When you are part of a corporate hierarchy, a military structure, or even a tight-knit social group, your individual brain divides the moral weight of any action across every member present. If 10 people are standing in a conference room while an authority figure makes a terrible decision, your brain calculates that you are only responsible for 1/10 of the potential fallout. The burden feels infinitely lighter, making obedience pathologically easy. So how do you rewrite a biological system that is so deeply programmed to bend the knee? How do you keep your prefrontal cortex awake and alive when authority demands your silence? You do not need to become a hostile rebel or a social outcast. You simply need to install intentional neural tripwires that force your brain out of the agentic state and back into autonomous agency. Here are 3 precise, science-backed strategies you can use in your daily life. First, master the technique known as the agency pause and frame shift. The agentic state relies entirely on momentum. Authority moves fast, using urgency and social pressure to keep your neural circuits from resetting. When an authority figure or supervisor gives you a direction that causes an internal moral twitch, your first job is to interrupt the temporal momentum. Create a physical pause of at least 4 seconds. Take a deliberate breath, shift your physical posture, and ask yourself one specific internal question. If I were standing here entirely alone in an empty room with no one to take the blame for me, would I choose this exact action? This question acts like an emergency brake on your prefrontal cortex. It forces your temporoparietal junction to re-engage, breaking the temporal binding suppression and reinstating your implicit sense of personal cause and effect. Second, deploy semantic reclaiming. Pay close attention to the inner dialogue you use when you obey. When we are slipping into authority-driven compliance, our internal language becomes heavily passive. We say to ourselves, "I have to do this," or "My boss requires me to sign this," or "I don't have a choice." This passive phrasing actively signals to your subcortical brain structures that you are an instrument, not an agent. To break this neural hypnosis, explicitly rewrite the sentence in your mind using active ownership words. Say, "I am choosing to follow this instruction because I value my employment, but I retain full ownership of my moral judgment." By framing it as an active choice rather than an inevitable force of nature, you preserve the neural circuits that monitor responsibility. Third, cultivate the micro-dissent anchor. Research in social psychology shows that once a person complies with a small, reasonable authority request, their threshold for obeying larger, unethical requests drops exponentially. It is the classic foot-in-the-door effect. To protect your brain from this slippery slope, practice setting tiny, non-confrontational boundaries early in any high-authority dynamic. If a powerful boss or dominant social leader makes a suggestion, exercise micro-dissent on a non-critical detail. You might say, "I agree with the overall goal, but I would prefer to handle this second task slightly differently." By establishing a micro-boundary early, You signal to your own neural network that your agency is intact and operational, preventing the master safety breaker from tripping when high-stakes pressure arrives. Look closely at your past choices. Think of all those moments when you stayed silent in a room full of people, when you nodded along with a directive you knew was wrong, or when you let someone with a title make a decision that violated your fundamental values. For years, you may have carried a quiet shame about those moments. You may have told yourself that you were spineless, or that you lacked courage, or that you were fundamentally weak. But now you see the truth written in the very structure of your brain. You were not weak, you were caught in an ancient evolutionary biological trap. Your brain was running a defense program designed hundreds of thousands of years ago to preserve group cohesion and protect you from social exclusion. Your brain was simply doing what it was engineered to do under hierarchical pressure. But understanding the program gives you the ultimate power to rewrite it. You are no longer an unconscious passenger in the agentic state. You are now aware of the hidden tripwires, the neural binding shifts, and the silent diffusion of responsibility that tries to pull you into compliance. The next time authority demands your silence, you will recognize the physical shift in your mind for what it truly is, a biological invitation to yield. And in that precise moment of awareness, you have the profound ability to choose differently. You now possess the hidden blueprint to your own compliance mechanisms. Use this knowledge not just to protect your own autonomy, but to understand the invisible forces driving the behavior of everyone around you. If this deep dive into the hidden architecture of the mind opened your eyes, subscribe to Habit Decoded. We are unearthing the real neuroscience and psychology behind why humans think, feel, and behave the way they do, one hidden biological mechanism at a time. And consider this, while your brain is wired to respond to authority, there is another equally powerful biological mechanism quietly operating in the background, subtly altering your memory of past events every single time you recall them. Next, we will explore the terrifying neurochemistry of how your own mind secretly rewrites your history without your permission. Welcome to your decoded mind.